his history at the University of Reading, where he specializes in modern German history, the World Wars, and the Cold War period. And his talk this morning will be on a unique case of cooperation between British scientists and German scientists in the immediate post-war years. After that, we'll have a Q&A session where you can ask questions of our speakers using the Ask a Question function, which many of you have on your screens. So, on to Professor Major.
Right. So I'm talking about strange collaboration based on papers that I discovered with a colleague, Christopher Scott, who's in the meteorology department at Reading, who can't be here today, but at Harwell, at the Rutherford Appleton laboratory, we found the papers of one of the scientists involved here, Roy Piggott, who was the right-hand man of Sir Edward Appleton. They were in a kind of locked filing cabinet, which no one had looked at for decades, and the local archivist eventually lost patience and just ripped the top of it off. And we found this amazing treasure trove. I'll partly be talking about an episode which R.V. Jones talks about in Most Secret War, about this strange relocation of the German space scientists from what was then Austria into Germany in 1946. But the kind of science that we're talking about is ionospheric science. So Edward Appleton was the, if you like, pioneer of research into the ionosphere, going right back to the early 1930s. Now, if you need refreshing what the ionosphere is, it's essentially an electrified field high in the Earth's atmosphere, which gets recharged every day when the sun shines on it, and then it depletes in the evening. What the practical implications are for radio traffic, particularly short wave radio traffic, is that this leads to kind of disruptions and different frequencies which had to be used. So during World War II, if you can see this here, this is a diagram actually from Edward Appleton trying to explain ionospheric science to the UK military establishment. I mean, what happens if you ping a radio signal, an impulse from the ground, if it's a particularly high frequency, it will just go right out into space. But if it's at a low enough frequency, it will be reflected back to Earth. And even though radio waves go in a straight line, you can actually increase the range up to thousands of kilometers. So the practical implications of this were for long-term radio transmissions, which both sides knew about already. I mean, what the British were beginning to discover was that in order to predict the weather, the space weather, and whether a solar storm was coming, particularly stations which are in higher latitudes, for instance, in Canada, were particularly useful for giving early warning. So these were some of the figures that I want to talk about on the British side of the equation. So this is Edward Appleton, who was the also the head of the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research in World War II. So he's partly interested in sort of applying some of these lessons, not just to military applications, but also interested in pure science. And his agenda is to have a kind of grand ionospheric project, even after the war, and he wants to build up on some of these networks that he already knew. He knew the Germans before the war, so he knows which people he wants to sort of pull into various experiments, which involve pinging messages to each other from Slough, which is where the British radio station was, to this new station that I'll explain. This is Roy Piggott, who by all accounts was the kind of closest anybody has to a kind of Professor Brainstorm. He's kind of an eccentric figure who is really a scientist who gets seconded, I think, to the army. But the other people interested in this acquisition of not just German know-how, but also German technology, some of the transmitting apparatus. This is R.V. Jones, from which we got this first account of this episode of the convoy at Lindau. So he's ADI science at the Air Ministry, but his right-hand man, and one of the key figures here is Eric Ackermann, who again is really a scientist who gets made an honorific flight lieutenant and is in charge of the overseas party of ADI. That means he gets sent to Germany, and what Piggott is doing is acting as the kind of overseas arm of Edward Appleton, who's sending him to Germany for DSIR. And so they're looking for, so these are the sorts of things that they were producing during World War II, and they were trying to find out if the Germans were doing this too. Aware that the ionosphere was very chaotic, it changes a lot, so they were producing weather forecasts. So this is actually an ionospheric map showing which frequencies could be used over a relatively long period. I think they were also aware that things like solar activity, solar storms could severely disrupt things. So what happens in Easter 1940 is there's a major solar storm which just really knocks out all radio traffic. And this actually gives the impulse where Goering gives huge resources to the German ionospheric scientists to start a program which then comes to interest the British. So these are some of them. Particularly you may be aware of Hans Plendel here, who became a kind of scientific manager of huge resources for not just the ionosphere, but he's in charge of the F section of the Zentralstelle für Funkberatung, which is the kind of radio forecasting agency. But Plendel is responsible for things like Knickerbein and the X-Geräte, and gets a certain amount of sort of institutional kudos for this. And what he does is he brings in some sort of slightly maverick scientists who can't get jobs in the German academic system. But this is Walter Dieminger, who becomes the sort of central figure at Lindau, but he's the kind of head of ionospheric research. One of the most interesting figures is this one, Karl Otto Kiepenheuer, who is brought in, who's particularly interested in coronagraphs, photographing the sun, looking at solar activity. And what seems to be happening, at least from my perspective, is that some of these scientists are actually pushing some of their own pure science agendas and using Luftwaffe money to do this. And then they have a certain, if you like, bankability for the British scientists at the end of the war. But what the British are particularly interested in is the fact that the Germans have quite an extensive network, so that they need a north-south axis starting at Tromsø, coming down from Oslo, down through kind of Rechlin, right down to Syracuse in Sicily. But then they also have an eastern station at Mykolaiv in the Ukraine, and they also appropriate the Paris Meudon Observatory. In particular, Kiepenheuer that I just showed you is put in to really manage those people. And what they're doing is often predating, they're just stealing various kind of observatory equipment and using it for themselves. And then after the war, there's a huge tussle for who does this stuff actually belong to? Should it actually be returned or not? What Kiepenheuer in particular does is to build up a whole series of solar observatories in the Alps. And this is, again, one of the things which the Germans have, which we don't have, is high mountains to actually do some of these observations. So we're quite interested in getting hold of control of some of these areas. But in particular, the French have a bone to grind with the others because they've been exploited. So the French in particular are one of the major players about trying to recoup some of the assets and also the personnel of the German scientific community. But this is the first one that's produced in, I think, in Bavaria, but Austria. Now, increasingly, the German solar scientific community migrates from Rechlin, which had been north of Berlin. But if you remember the Oslo reports in 1939, it suggested that that would be a good place to bomb. And so in 1943, they migrate to Austria. So they're trying to sort of keep out of range. And in particular, they set up here a place called Leobersdorf, south of Vienna. But by the time the end of the war is approaching, the Red Army are coming in from this direction. So they make a wise, if you like, executive decision to migrate to here, to Ried, which becomes the American sector of Austria. And they kind of reinvent themselves as not so much a Luftwaffe research institution, but the so-called Fraunhofer Institute. So Kiepenheuer, who was building the observatories, gets a foot in the door at Freiburg University, and then suddenly all of these scientists are essentially portraying themselves after 1945 as, if you like, university researchers rather than military researchers. But this creates a kind of problem that the Russians might potentially say, hang on, this stuff belongs to us. There are lots of hints being dropped by the German scientists that maybe they will have to go and work for the Russians if no one else is going to employ them. But what emerges after a fact-finding mission by the Fiat, the Field Intelligence Agency Technical, sends various solar scientists out to Germany in September 45, and they really go and visit all of these different sites and try to kind of divvy up who should be in control of what. And by general consensus then, the British, because we're preeminent in ionospheric research, are allowed to suggest that we actually move this REIT Institute up into the British zone. But there are competitors here and reasons that this might have to be done covertly. So in particular, this is the French member of this mission, Rocard, who later on becomes the father of the French atomic bomb, but has a lot of interest in trying to set up a French ionospheric service, particularly for the Navy. This is Gerard Kuiper. You may have heard of the Kuiper belts out in the solar system, but he was in charge of the Yerkes laboratory. The big sort of mystery for me is why the Americans don't really seem to be interested in this. Constantly, the Brits are having to write to him saying, please, can you send us a letter that the Americans, have an interest in some of this material. But they seem to be happy, at least at the top level, to let the British take the lead. The Russians are probably just wondering what's going on. It's very unclear. So essentially, Piggott and Ackerman, I think, go slightly rogue when they discover that various groups like Property Control in the American zone of Austria are going to try and block them. And Ackerman acquires various SIS one-use pads for kind of top secret transmission. They get together 70 trucks. This is not an actual photo of it, but it's for illustrative purposes. 70 British 3-ton trucks. And they transport about 200 personnel from Ried on a quite hair-raising journey in the middle of winter over the mountains through the American zone of Austria into the US zone of Austria and then up to the British zone. And where they end up at is near the Iron Curtain, just sort of east of Göttingen. These were some of the things which we found, these kind of code names that they gave each other. There was an amazing set of radio transmissions where it's a bit like a kind of schoolboy's venture. They're giving themselves the identities of Odysseus returning on this great epic journey. And the Germans are all in on this. And the Germans, are deeply grateful for the British. Well, partly what they do is they also say, look, here was our Nazi supervisor. He's got no kind of real physics. Please get rid of him. So the British allocate him to be the caretaker at this institute once they've left. So once they do finally arrive, and it is a really horrific journey, one of their children of the scientists dies en route, they finally do get to Lindau in about March 1946. And this is a disused barracks that they use, and the initial working conditions are horrific. No food, no money, constant complaints that they can't really get anything done. So extremely primitive conditions. But in the longer term, they do actually get these experiments going. So between about 1946 and 1947, and the Germans are kind of building some of their own equipment. And they're being partly bankrolled by DSIR, but some of their work, which was intelligence related, and this is where I'm still at slight mystery exactly what they were doing, was being paid for by the Research Bureau of British military government. Ackermann was siphoning off some of this material and equipment for use for his empire of SIGINT, where he was in charge of listening into the Soviet zone. And I suppose here I'm pleading, if there's anybody out there or watching now who was part of that SIGINT community or might be able to explain what oblique incidents research in the ionosphere might have been doing, I'd be very pleased to hear. But it's very difficult to work out exactly what the military applications were. At the end of the day, I think it's there are winners and losers. This is Kiepenheuer, who finally gets to make it to the US after the French have been trying to stop him leaving in 1950. And Kuiper uses all of his knowledge to bring out his Kuiper belt theory, and then essentially ditches Kiepenheuer. So his career really kind of comes to an end there. But you might ask, where was Plendel in all of this? Well, he'd already gone via Operation Paperclip. This is where he managed to actually use the fact that he'd protected unwittingly one of the major if you like, intelligence betrayers of the Third Reich, Hans Ferdinand Mayer, who wrote the Oslo report. But after he was caught saying negative things about the war, he was put in Dachau concentration camp. But Plendel put him in charge of a radio research program. And then he used that, if you like, good deed, even though he had been in the Nazi party, to get to the US. But I think at the end of the day, what I discovered from this was, if you think that hierarchies are kind of backbiting in the military, you should try it in academia. And these professors, some of them are just not prepared to work with each other, but with this addition of the kind of Nazi skeletons in the closet, this made it a very attractive proposition for some of the Germans to get this British protection. And in the end of the day, I think the scientists used the RAF more than the RAF used the military. So thanks for your attention.